Hello, welcome to the fifth IPQ debate, this time on the election results, implications for Germany's foreign policy. I'm Henning Hoff, executive editor of Internationale Politik quarterly. As polls had predicted, Friedrich Merz and his center-right Christian Democrats, the CDU-CSU, came first with 28% of the vote, and that was largely as predicted. Friedrich Merz will now swiftly move to build another coalition with the center-left Social Democrats, or SPD, minus outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz. The SPD suffered a historic defeat, winning only 16.4% of the vote. In other words, Germany will see another Große Koalition, a GroKo, or so-called Grand Coalition, which was indeed grand when such a government was first formed in post-war West Germany between 1966 and 69 under Chancellor Kurt Georg Kiesinger. And even Angela Merkel's first government of her CDU-CSU with the SPD had a two-thirds majority in 2005. But during Merkel's time, she led two more GroKos. The combined strength of the CDU-CSU and the SPD eroded, and Merz's prospective coalition had 328 seats out of 630, just 12 more than needed. Die Zeit has already suggested to call it a Kleiko, a little coalition. The far-right AFD, meanwhile, came second with 20.8% of the vote, a new high. Together with a resurgent hard left, the Linke party, which won 8.8%, it will be able in future to block constitutional changes, which require a two-thirds majority in the Bundestag, Germany's parliament. Merz wants a new government in place by Easter, which is roughly 7 weeks from now. And negotiations may start already this Sunday. The world isn't waiting for Germany, Merz said on election night. He later stressed that his priority was strengthening Europe so that it could be independent of the United States, quite a step for someone who used to be the president of Atlantikbrücke, Germany's foremost transatlantic network. It points to an end of the status quo, which we focused on in our winter issue, which I'll post a link in a little moment. To discuss the outcome of Germany's election, I have the great pleasure of welcoming two distinguished colleagues who are covering German politics very closely for international audiences. With us is Michaela Küfner, chief political editor of Deutsche Welle, Germany's international broadcaster, for which she is also doing live reporting and high-profile interviews with German and international leaders. Welcome, Michaela.
Great to be here.
It's a great pleasure. And also with us is Tom Nuttall, Berlin bureau chief of The Economist, who since last year is on his second stint in the German capital. During his first time in Berlin, he inter alia wrote in 2021 the cover story, The Mess Merkel Leaves Behind. At that time, the Merkel years were still widely considered a success. Welcome, Tom.
Thanks, Henning. Good to be with you.
We have 45 minutes and want to jump right into it, with myself putting a few questions to our panelists. After some discussion, we'll be opening up for your questions and comments. To join the debate, please raise your virtual hand, and I'll invite you to pose your question or observation in person to the panel. You're also welcome to use the chat function. Please note that this event is recorded and will be published subsequently. So, and let's start now with Michaela. Merz wants to form another GroKo and have a new government in place by Easter. Do you expect it will be all plain sailing, or do you foresee obstacles in this building of another coalition?
Well, of course, I mean, it's almost a rhetorical question. It's already getting a bit noisy. We're seeing Friedrich Merz, who even at his last campaign event just before the elections said there would be an end to the leftist crazy kind of politics, which was an insult, and it was also felt as an insult by the Social Democrats, who he now has to woo into a coalition, which will be a tough sell for them and to their own members. So no, it will not be smooth sailing. At the same time, the pressure is on for Germany to get its political act together and provide what Europe requires kind of as a minimum brand coming out of Germany, which is stability. And that stability will have to be negotiated in what will be painful discussions, and already are, for Friedrich Merz, who is very swift and grand in saying he will, and he made a huge foreign policy speech ahead of the elections where he said Germany would become a leading nation again, from a sleeping middle power. It will become a leading middle power again. But he's not chancellor yet. And these few, what feels like historical millimeters to get a coalition together will feel very painful here in Germany. Also, as the Social Democrats do what they tend to do as a reflex almost after elections, which is fight amongst themselves as well. So this is a very tricky one, but the challenges couldn't be greater. Somehow Germany, somehow Europe needs to catch up with the news that's coming thick and fast from Washington, and the facts that are being created on the ground, not just over Ukraine, but also on trade. We just saw Donald Trump announce that those 25% tariffs will be coming. He also accuses the European Union of having been founded essentially against the United States, and that's something he's up against. And that's also why we saw him meeting with Emmanuel Macron, which is highly unusual. He's acting like a chancellor-elect, but he has to do what he finds toughest at times. He really has CEO-style politics, and now he has to become very much diplomatic in those talks with the Social Democrats.
Thank you, Ash. We come to the foreign policy implications in a moment. But Tom, do you agree? Will it be rocky after all? Because what I'm hearing from the SPD is they're quite willing to do this because it's the only option on the table.
Yeah, I mean, of course it will be difficult. I mean, it always is. They'll get there in the end, I'm pretty confident. Partly for that reason, you know, they both need each other. One German paper, I forget which it was, compared the two parties to two drunks leaning on each other for support. And I quite like that metaphor. I think it sort of describes the situation of the relationship the two parties have to one another quite well. Merz wanted an election outcome that would deliver him a choice of coalition partner between the SPD and the Greens. He didn't get that. It's worth emphasizing, I think, that this was really quite a bad result for the CDU-CSU, 28.5%. I think it was second worst in history, significantly below even the 30% mark that they had hoped for. So he needs the SPD. That grants them a fair degree of leverage in the talks to come, because they know he has nowhere else to go. But it cuts both ways. You know, every German can see that there is essentially no viable government other than what I think we should probably now retire, the name of the Grand Coalition, because I'll have such a small majority. So I think that the kind of that logic will ultimately prevail, and I mean, in sort of content terms, you know, there's not that much keeping the parties apart. I mean, there's obviously differences in every area. That's why they're different political parties. But I don't see that many areas in which it will be, in which it's very difficult to kind of find a common thread. You know, I mean, I don't know how much detail we want to get into, but the CDU has proposed all sorts of unfunded tax cuts. I don't think they're going to get very many of them. On the minimum wage and on Bürgergeld, you know, some of these things will sort of take care of themselves. There's a kind of logic pushing in a certain direction where the SPD will be able to make concessions, I think. I think the one area I might worry about a little bit is on migration, partly because Merz, before the election, made these proposals that I think kind of plainly contradict German law and European law on turnbacks at the border of asylum seekers. And he also said he wouldn't compromise on them. And I think this was a fairly rash promise that he may come to regret. My sense is that they might find a way through because we have a new set of EU rules coming into force next year. They may be able to find some kind of proposal that can bridge the period between the government taking office and those new EU rules taking office. One slight sort of wrinkle is that, as I'm sure everybody on this call knows, perhaps the most extraordinary story of the campaign was the surge of Die Linke, which, most of us thought just a few months ago was basically on the verge of extinction after the Wagenknecht group broke away from them a year ago. And instead, they surged to nearly 9% in the very last weeks of the campaign. It's interesting in itself. It's also interesting for something we'll probably get onto later, which is a proposal for a new fund for defense. But I think it's also going to, I talked to some people in the SPD, and they see that they lost voters on their left flank. This goes for the Greens as well, but it matters to the SPD because they're going to be in government.
And well, maybe let's sort of keep these sort of finer points also. Sort of let's stick with the prospective government for just for the moment, and then we'll sort of have another round where we will sort of talk about the other sort of rather striking elements of this election outcome, which will sort of also have an impact on the coming 4 years. But maybe let's go to Michaela back for a second. You already started to talk about Merz's foreign policy approach. He had dinner with French President Emmanuel Macron yesterday night. He's back in Berlin this morning. He's already he said at election night he's been in touch with a number of head of states and government in the EU. He said on election night, what I quote, wants to strengthen the Europe to make it independent of the United States. But the next day he said he would do everything to underpin the transatlantic relationship. Where do you see he will really land in the end?
Well, I asked him when he held his first press conference here at the Fraktion here in Parliament about this, and he actually no, at his very first press conference on Monday. Sorry, it's all a blur now. About what his message to the United States was, and while he in that talk show that Scholz quoted said he never thought he would say this, but Europe would have to get independent of the United States, and that really no longer is a tie that will necessarily stand the test of time. He at the same time, then when I asked about it on a Monday, he said he stressed the common values that both countries share, the long history and everything. So clearly he is someone who will do everything he possibly can to resuscitate, to keep alive the remaining ties. At the same time, he was unafraid, and I did do an interview with him straight after that speech by J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference, and his instant reaction was, look, we determine our own democracy and we will do it our way. So he's quite clear in his assessment of what the situation is. But let's not forget, he's still in an interim period. When he headed to Paris, my instant question to his people was, look, when are you going to head to Warsaw? Because essentially he's now doing as a not yet elected chancellor what he vowed to do pretty much on day one, which was to reconnect with the key allies. And it does highlight France, and he does highlight Poland there, to find a common line and for Germany to become a leading country again, not to any longer be the country that does the German vote thing as it did on the combustion engine issue in the EU, that people know exactly where Germany stands, and he wanted to get to work there. On the coalition building, I just want to add, it's always, at the end of the day, it's always about the money. And the key struggle we're seeing right now, which will go very deep into these coalition talks, is whether there will simply be a new wad of cash for German defense, which would be the most preferred outlook of Friedrich Merz at this moment in time, because it would be very swift and it would not force him to talk to the Social Democrats about other pet projects they may want to finance in the future. And the Social Democrats have an intrinsic motivation to make the reform of the debt brake happen now that they failed to get through with under Olaf Scholz and the old government, because let's not forget that's why that government imploded, over the refusal to touch the debt brake in Germany and to really give a bit more flexibility to a budget that really never happened. So that's where these negotiations will start, and it will be very interesting to see how fast we see some action on that.
It's all about money. Sometimes also about positions and ministerial posts. It's probably too early to talk about that, but Tom, would you say that the SPD will probably try to keep foreign affairs and defense as their prerogative, or do you think that's also sort of up in the air?
I mean, you talk to 10 people about the distribution of portfolios and the identity of the next ministers, and you get 20 different answers. So I tend to think speculation.
It's just so much fun.
Yeah, it's sort of a Berlin parlor game. I tend to think the speculation is a bit idle. That doesn't stop me from participating in it. I mean, clearly Boris Pistorius is going to retain an important role in the next government. He may want to keep his job. The CSU supposedly has its eye on the defense ministry so that they can funnel a lot of that lovely defense procurement money to Bavaria. The Lars Klingbeil supposedly has his eye on the foreign ministry. I don't know if the SPD would have both of those jobs. Perhaps they would if they let Merz get his way with the finance ministry. But, very quickly you get into kind of four-dimensional chess here. So there's not a lot that you can say about that. I just think on this this money question, it's really worth emphasizing this because, first of all, there's the debt brake issue and the fact that defense and security issues have become intermingled with fiscal issues in a way I've not previously seen in Germany. Merz became very cautious on the campaign trail when he was asked about his plans for financing the defense budget. The special fund established by Scholz just after the invasion of Ukraine runs out in 2027. We then need between 30 and 40 billion euros a year simply to meet the NATO floor of 2% of GDP, which everybody knows is looking increasingly obsolete now. We're now talking about 3.5, maybe even 4%. So that's why this very hasty and to some quite unseemly push to use the old Bundestag that is still around for a month to get a special fund through. But, as Michaela was saying, this quickly becomes bound up in broader negotiations about the future of the debt brake. The SPD and the Greens, of course, whose votes will be needed to do this because you need a 2/3 majority, are clearly going to seek to exact a price from Merz to do this. And it's very difficult to see how this is going to play out. We don't have much time. The next Bundestag is going to be convened, I think it's on the 25th of March. So they have to move very, very quickly. And the interaction between getting that done right now and what it might mean for the content of the coalition negotiations, which will almost certainly be ongoing at that point, is very important and very difficult to foresee.
So I take it you two are rather skeptical whether this topping up of the special fund, the sums I heard sort of being reported or being mentioned as something like 200 plus billion euros, which would already be a substantial amount of money and would also send a signal, of course, to European allies as well as to Washington. Do you think this is sort of on the more likely to happen before the new government comes in, or rather not? Michaela.
I believe it will. I believe it will happen because of the way it is being denied right now. That 200 billion figure that was reported by Bloomberg, I put that figure to Friedrich Merz. He refused to say anything about it. He said that he wouldn't confirm the figure either, but he wouldn't deny that the figure is out there. So clearly there are talks happening as we speak here about something like that. And my prediction is it will materialize just out of the sheer necessity the question for Friedrich Merz is how is he's going to pay for it in other ways. It might get very costly in terms of what he has to offer the Social Democrats to play ball on this. And that price tag we do not know, also because we do not have any kind of official confirmation of what the bullet point figure is at this moment in time. But 200 billion doesn't seem to be wrong enough for Friedrich Merz to deny it. So I would still go with that as kind of a measuring stick.
Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Something will have to happen. I mean, I think the kind of geopolitical realities have just become far too stark to ignore. The Greens, of course, this was the Greens' idea in the first place. They proposed it using the old Bundestag. Both the SPD and the Greens proposed it before the election. And, on the one hand, it's entirely reasonable for them to say it's absurd for us to be doing this now when we could have done it earlier. But on the other hand, this is where we are. Just one little wrinkle. Let's remember the European dimension to this, because the discussions at European level are also moving quite quickly. There are all sorts of proposals on the table to open up more European fiscal space for defense, adjusting the Maastricht criteria, potentially exempting defense spending from the calculations of fiscal deficits, even kind of Euro bonds, which will be a very, very difficult sell, particularly for the union fraction. But, one possibility might be that if the domestic discussion gets stuck, it essentially gets booted up to European level. And, Merz has become slightly less strident on that issue, on the European financing issue, than he was a few months ago. And I'm not entirely sure that he knows exactly what his policy is there. So there's so many moving parts here. But I think if I had to bet, will we see some sort of decision made on this in the next 4 weeks? I would say yes, but I'd be very unsure about exactly what that decision is going to be.
Yeah. One other problem seems to be that Merz isn't sure sort of how his party sort of will react to not only changes to the constitutional debt brake, but also on European level financing, where it's completely, or to me at least, it's unclear where the CDU is exactly now. But maybe let's spend 2 or 3 minutes on other aspects of the outcome of the election, which don't really sort of immediately affect the government building, but still sort of quite consequential. You already started about the Linke, Tom. It was surprising to most of us. I think their search only happened very late after Merz sort of did his move on migration and voted together with the AFD. What do you think are the long-term consequences?
Well, let's see. I mean, in a kind of ordinary world, possibly not that much, I mean, they were obviously represented in the last parliament. They will have more MPs now than they did then, but not a kind of sort of making the weather level of MPs. I think there's 2 things to think about when it comes to Die Linke. On the domestic side, it's that the SPD and the Greens now both know that they have vulnerabilities on their left flank. And I think this will influence internal discussions in both those parties. In the Greens, you may well see a revival of the old kind of wing debates between the Fundis and the Realos. That would be a sort of an internal matter for the Greens, because they're not needed for anything other than sort of debt brake or Sondervermögen votes. With the SPD, it's obviously more consequential. And this is why I think this could have an impact on the coalition talks. For example, there will now be, when they are, when the union is pushing them very hard to tighten asylum policy, there will be voices inside the SPD saying, if we give too much ground here, then we are going to lose more voters to Die Linke. So that will act as a political constraint on their ability to give away too much on that front. Then on the foreign policy front, it's just what we've been talking about. Die Linke's votes now, some Die Linke votes, I think only about 7, would be needed for any sort of constitutional change. I actually interviewed their leader a couple of days ago. She could not have been clearer. She said, they will need us to do this. I will extract a very high price. You can be very sure of that. And that, I think, that dynamic is one reason why, perhaps the reason why, Merz is now pursuing this unorthodox idea of Bundestag, because I think he probably knows that not only would he have to make some very, very expensive concessions to Die Linke to win over any votes on the debt brake in the new parliament, that once he starts to do that, then the hardliners in his own ranks will be like, why are we doing deals with these ex-commies? This is when we didn't even want to relax a debt brake in the first place. And that is just really not a situation that Friedrich Merz wants to find himself in. Mm-hmm. So you can see the strength of Die Linke already beginning to exert itself in the way that the political dynamics are working now.
Michaela, is there something else you would like to highlight, sort of as a part of the election result which hasn't been paid enough attention yet?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to follow up on that and just stress that from foreign Ukraine policy angle, of course, Die Linke is against military support towards Ukraine. So is the far-right Alternative for Germany party, and so is BSV. So in the next parliament, you have almost a third. BSV is not in the parliament, but the voting results show that almost parties were voted for who are against the continuous support of Ukraine in military and financial terms as well. So that's an issue, and that could be, if that's the kind of price that Die Linke would want to extract, most likely they would settle for social spending, but, these social democrats want that too. So it would get very pricey indeed. And at the same time, I just want to debunk something that is that I come across all the time in many interviews that I do. That I keep seeing that chart that it could have been so much easier for Friedrich Merz to form a coalition if only he crossed that firewall and went into a coalition with the far-right Alternative for Germany party. And the reason why many people vote conservative is because it has ruled out any kind of cooperation coalition with the far-right AFD party, and not despite. So that chart, although it's numerically correct, is logically wrong. So because I get that question a lot.
Thank you very much. Important to point out, especially to international observers who are not so close to what's happening in Germany. We are past the 25 minutes line, so I would welcome you to come in as well with questions and comments you might have. For that, best way to do so is to raise your hand, and then I call you up and ask you to put your question to the panel. While you may sort of collect your thoughts, and I'd like to open up with a comment by Reinhard Bütikofer, who has been or was an MEP, a member of the European Parliament for a long time, very influential foreign affairs specialist among the Greens, and he asks or quotes Herfried Münkler, who's a scientist, political scientist, saying the incoming coalition is already stumbling. Alice Weidel, the co-leader of the AFD, has said it won't last the whole parliamentary period. Do you agree? Will it be so terrible, or so rocky that the Merz government won't last a full term?
First of all, hello to Mr. Bütikofer. I really enjoyed doing interviews with him. He probably has so much political experience that he would have a very qualified answer to this. Frankly, we've just seen over the past 3 weeks, we've just seen NATO being called into question. We've seen the transatlantic relationship completely crumble. And I think a lot will depend on external factors. I do believe with Olaf Scholz out of the picture and a new generation of leadership in the Social Democrats, particularly with a very pragmatic, still Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, there is a real chance to have a solid government. But the issue of spending and whether the debt brake will be reformed, I think that will be an early warning system over, how they solve this, how they resolve, once they've resolved that and have overcome this and formed a coalition, I think they're pretty solid to go. And I think the pain is still there from having seen a government implode, this three-way coalition we just saw. So my prediction would be that the maximum motivation is there to make it happen. But then let's see what these external factors are. But my prediction would be that it would last a full term. I mean, they have a better chance than the last government, whose huge failure was to renegotiate a coalition agreement. And we see the lessons learned this time. You're hearing both sides say, well, we won't have this big fat marriage contract, which lays down every project that we're planning over the next 4 years. This time they want more of a wholesale agreement. I think that will be an interesting question, whether that produces more stability or produces more arguments over what the next step will be.
Yeah, as you say, so the longer they get, the sort of or a long document not necessarily sort of solves all the problems or makes sure that there will not be subsequent discussions or infighting. So maybe it's time to try a shorter version of it. But Tom, do you also think that it will last its time? Because I'm hearing from the SPD that they are a bit worried about Merz not being experienced in leading a government and having this style of sort of follow me, please. This is what I want to do, and no questions asked. So
please.
Yeah, exactly. So Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the predictions are hard, especially about the future, right? Like, who knows? I agree that Merz's inexperience is potentially a problem, and I think actually it's showing in some respects. I think it was very odd for him to spend election eve ranting about left-wing nutters, and this kind of odd thing that the party did the other day, you know, about these NGOs, regardless of the merits or otherwise of this proposal. It's a very strange thing to do at just a moment when you need to be getting into a room with your political opponents. I think the force of external events, I think, is exactly right. I think that will probably act as a glue for the coalition, a kind of sense that that there's a very strong national interest in having political stability in Germany. But two domestic things I would point to. One, which we haven't really mentioned because there's so much other stuff going on, is the dismal state of the German economy, you know, which in real terms has basically not grown for 6 years. And it's been in a mild recession for 2 of those years, and the forecasts for this year are pretty bleak as well. And we interviewed Merz a few weeks ago about this, and I'm pretty skeptical that he and the people around him have really thought hard enough about the fundamental changes needed to adjust Germany's business model, its dependence on exports, in particular, and the need to boost domestic consumption. And I'm not quite sure how long Germans are going to put up with every week hearing news of kind of thousands more jobs being cut at an industrial giant, or more Volkswagen plants being closed or whatever it is. So I think this is going to be a major theme for the next government. And the other, which we also haven't spoken very much about, is, of course, the AFD. It's now like hegemonic in Eastern Germany. I think there were only 3 constituencies in the old GDR that the AFD didn't win. It also grew very quickly, of course, from a much lower base in the West. And we have an election in Saxony-Anhalt at some point next year, which is one of the strongholds for the AFD. And this firewall policy, which has remained intact, and I give Merz credit for that. I think he's robust on that. It's really creaking now in the East. We saw what happened in particular in Thuringia and also in Saxony, where the strength of the AFD in those states has basically led to some extremely weird governing coalitions. In Thuringia, of course, we've got CDU in coalition with Wagenknecht in a minority government. In Saxony, we have a real minority government, you know, a long way short of a majority. Talk to AFD people, and they think that government is going to fall apart, and they'll be perfectly placed to capitalize on it. So while I respect the very robust stance that Merz has taken on this, I don't totally know if it's going to be possible to hold that in the way that he hopes to do in the next few years. And this is a danger to Germany. Let's not sugarcoat this. You know, this is a party that has grown more radical as it has grown more popular, probably in part because of the Brandmauer policy. So this is the other big kind of domestic dynamic that I think could cause real trouble for the next government in the next few years.
Thank you very much. I still would like to encourage our viewers, if you want to put a question in person to the panel, please do so, because that sort of always makes for a livelier interaction. But I would like to pick two things from the chat. There's one question or two foreign policy questions actually. One refers to Germany's future China policy. Sort of how will Merz sort of play that? He had made noises during the campaign that he wants a tougher policy vis-à-vis Beijing, but with a crumbling transatlantic relationship, maybe things look a little different now. And a question about Africa. Is that something which you would think the incoming government would pay more attention to? Maybe Michaela first.
Yes, two things. He made very clear that he will take a tougher stance on China, and particularly on German investment in China, which was very remarkable. He did single out that if companies decide to take that risk, and he described it as a risk to invest in China, that the government would no longer vouch for that. Usually the government gives guarantees for investment in other countries. So clearly he's planning on either scrapping that or scaling it down significantly. And so that certainly the business community will take note of that. On Africa, I think it was quite notable that he left out. I got the advanced copy of the foreign policy speech he held, and he was initially going to speak about German economic assistance and cooperation, and that of course affects Africa a lot. And he left that bit out. The expectation is here that he will take a decision whether he splits the economic or essentially development assistance up and gives it in parts to the Trade Ministry and the Foreign Ministry. This is still an open debate, and I think a lot will depend on how many ministries will be needed at the end of the day. And I think we can all watch very closely what happens there. Of course, Africa is a lot more than development assisted, but I think it's kind of a very interesting take on what German foreign trade policy will be in the future. And that will, of course, also affect the African continent. He wants to be a lot more strategic about that. And we already saw Olaf Scholz travel to Africa. I was with him in Senegal, where he wanted alternative energy sources. He wanted to tap into gas there as well. LNG, he was looking for alternatives. And I dare say a lot of that may not necessarily be continued, but we haven't really seen him single out or lay out what he specifically plans on the African continent.
Thank you very much. Tom?
China is fascinating. I mean, the thing is, Germany is going to have no choice but to change its China policy, and in fact has already been changing its China policy. Talk to anybody in the Auswärtiges and they will point you to the China policy that the previous government produced, although there were a lot of disagreements between the Chancellor and the Ministry on that. The reason it's going to have to change is because the nature of the relationship has always been economic-led, and the nature of the economic relationship is experiencing, a revolution, basically. Under Merkel, China, that it was kind of symbiotic, growing Chinese needs for German manufactured goods. Germany's export-led model found this huge and rapidly growing customer. It was a match made in heaven. Now China is increasingly acting as a competitor for Germany in everything from industry to cars to also some of the smaller goods that the Mittelstand are manufacturing. It's also, there are economic changes taking place inside of China which have huge consequences for Germany. China is now relying on surpluses generated in other countries to soak up its goods. And if the Chinese-American trading relationship deteriorates, as many expect, then China is going to need other markets for its exports, and Europe and Germany is going to be close to the top of that list. You're already starting to see that dynamic play out. And that, I think, is one, Merz is savvy enough to be aware of these. And that's one reason why I think it is that he issued this warning to German firms considering making big investments in China that, it's at their own risk, essentially, don't come crying to us for bailouts. So that is a crucial thing. I don't have a whole lot to say about Africa specifically, other than Merz has said that in foreign policy and in development policy, he will be linking it to migration policy. So if you want a nice trading relationship, if you want good diplomatic relationships, then you're going to have to agree to take back more of your migrants. The one thing I would say is that I think perhaps a slightly underrated element of Olaf Scholz chancellorship was a serious investment in diplomatic relations with what we have started to call the Global South, not, of course, limited to Africa. And this was actually part of the government's Ukraine policy, apart from anything else. So they're very keen to ensure as broad a range of support for the stance against Russia as possible. So I will be watching the next government's diplomatic stance to see if this is something they continue to invest as much energy in as the Olaf Scholz government did.
I just want to add on China, though, that everything we know so far wasn't under the impression of the United States turning its back on Europe. And if Europe is out alone, I would expect Friedrich Merz to take a new hard look at what China may have to offer just to get less dependent of the United States, which is not going to be an easy transition or choice to make. But I really think that that is going to be a dynamic process, depending on how terrible the breakdown of the family relationship with the United States becomes.
Mm. Thank you very much. And just sort of as we enter the final 5 minutes, we've got two hands up, and I'd like to call them both very quickly. The first speaker I can introduce myself is Milan, the German Council on Foreign Relations expert on Central and Eastern Europe. Milan, please.
Thank you, Henning. I just heard your call to help. So two questions. One, I was in Prague yesterday on a discussion on post-election Germany, and what struck me is the enormous expectations from Merz, and also what reported in the press. There is a belief that he will form the coalition quickly. Even as a neighbor, this Czech foreign policy elite underestimates how much domestic focused the next government will have to be, how tricky and complex it is. Do you see it also elsewhere, or what does it mean if the EU partners, even the close ones, don't see the domestic sort of complications? And second thing is the famous idea of reforming the chancellery and creating a National Security Council. Where do you see this going?
Thank you very much.
Well, I would expect the National Security Council to happen. Simple as that. And the other issue is, yes, they know that the expectations are high, and it really is. It feels like it's only this far they have to go politically before Friedrich Merz can start acting as a stabilizing force and bring Germany into leading role together with Emmanuel Macron in the European Union. But it's a very, very tough few inches or centimeters, whichever way you want to put it, that they have to transition to, because there's also already, we're hearing a call that any kind of coalition agreement, no matter how short it is, could be put to a vote by the Social Democrats. And I remember doing a piece, maybe somebody remembers, in the last Merkel government, there was a vote, and it was a very tight one, and there was that vote on this coalition deal within the Social Democrats determined whether everything stays exactly the same, essentially, or whether German politics are turned on their head. And we could face a similar scenario here, because not everybody, not all the grassroots in the SPD are happy about feeling like they're forced into government again to take responsibility when they feel that their own party needs some kind of renewal and a new generation of leaders and a new compass, because they too fear that the Social Democrats are in decline. They used to be a big tent party, but that tent is folding fast. And they also live in fear of being thrown into political oblivion come 2029.
Thank you very much. And Tom, you've got the final word. I'm really sorry, Mr. Schmidt, but we are running out of time. So Tom, your concluding thoughts.
Sure. Yeah. No. Hello, Milan. The appetite for German leadership in Europe is palpable. You can really feel it. And Merz's people know this very, very well. Their kind of demands for people to come and see him when they visit Berlin they tell me it's impossible to meet it. And I reported a story on Brussels a few months ago. This kind of absence of Germany in Europe under Scholz is something that people really, really felt. It was partly to do with the weakness of the coalition, partly to do with the weakness of the Chancellor. So the domestic dynamics obviously are important there. I do think that Merz will take foreign policy seriously. I think he will have no choice to. I think he's demonstrated that to a certain extent. Other countries may underestimate the significance of the domestic dynamics and difficulties, but then they always do, right? Like, why should any country care about what Germany is going to do with Bürgergeld when it might matter a hell of a lot for the Union and the SPD? So Merz has said all of the right things. It's good to see him jetting off to have dinner with Emmanuel Macron. It's good to see him saying he's going to re-emphasize the Weimar Triangle relations with Poland, all the rest of it. But, nothing has happened yet. He's not Chancellor, as we were saying before. He's very inexperienced. I have some concerns about his tendency to sort of shoot first and think later. So, he said the right things. He's done the right things so far, but there's a hell of a long way to go. So I hope that appetite that you detect across Europe will be satisfied. But I'm sorry, this is a very weak way to end things, but we will just have to wait and see.
Okay. And with that, I'm bringing this IPQ debate to a close. Please join me in thanking our two panelists, Michaela Küfner and Tom Nuttall. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much also to our audience for coming along. And the next IPQ debate will happen in May. So stay tuned for that. Check out our website for the spring issue, which will be up in about 4 weeks' time, and for continuous news also about how the Merz government will be formed. Also, so follow us and see what happens. So thank you very much. Thanks again to our panelists, and have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.